The camera opens on silence. A vast hangar, empty now. Dust floats through the shafts of morning light, cutting across rows of abandoned steel riveters and rusted conveyor belts. The sound of footsteps echoes, slow, deliberate, as if walking through the bones of a giant that once breathed fire. Then faintly, the ghost of an engine's roar, the metallic rattle of 1,000 hammers, and a voice, calm, steady, almost reverent. In the middle of the Michigan farmland, they built a factory so large it had its own weather. This was Willow Run, the largest manufacturing plant of its kind in the world, a place where dreams of flight met the brutal arithmetic of war. In 1941, while Europe burned and America armed itself for a fight it could no longer ignore, one man looked at a blueprint of a bomber and saw something no one else did. A car. His name was Charles Sorensen, a Danish-born foundryman who had spent his life surrounded by the smell of hot oil and molten steel. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a pilot. He was an engineer. Quiet, methodical, and relentless. But when the United States called for bombers, thousands of them, Sorensen answered not with words, but with a vision that would change how wars were fought. At that time, building a B-24 Liberator, a massive 4-engine heavy bomber, was an ordeal. Each one required over 1.25 million parts, 300,000 rivets, and more than 500,000 individual operations. Factories worked around the clock, yet even the best could produce only one plane every month. The math was cruel. The Allies were losing faster than industry could build. Sorensen stared at that equation and refused to accept it. He had spent decades by Henry Ford's side, turning automobiles into a symbol of American power. He knew the rhythm of mass production, the synchronized dance of conveyor belts, stamping machines, and human precision. But airplanes? They were still handcrafted like jewelry, each built in place piece by skilled artisans. Beautiful, but slow. To Sorensen, that was unacceptable. He didn't see the bomber as a marvel of craftsmanship. He saw it as a problem of motion. If a car could be built in hours, he once said, then why should a bomber take months? And so, in the winter of 1941, under the dim light of the drafting room, Sorensen sketched something that defied convention, a moving assembly line for bombers. A single, continuous flow. One end began with aluminum sheets. The other would roll out a fully armed B-24, ready for war. It sounded impossible. Planes were too big, too complex, too fragile for conveyor lines. But Sorensen wasn't chasing perfection. He was chasing speed. He believed that in war, perfection kills progress. When he presented the idea, many laughed. Even within Ford's own ranks, engineers doubted him. The Army Air Corps was skeptical. They'd seen too many promises, too many miracle plans that ended in chaos. But Henry Ford, ever the gambler, looked at Sorensen, his old Iron Master, and nodded. "Do it," Ford said, and that was enough. By early 1942, construction began on Willow Run, a name that sounded peaceful, but would soon roar like a forge. It stretched across 67 acres, a mile-long building with its own rail yard, power plant, and fire station. It was so vast that rain clouds sometimes formed inside the ceiling, releasing drizzles over the workers below. And yet, even in this colossal place, Sorensen faced a problem greater than steel or machines. He needed people, tens of thousands of them. Men and women, many who had never seen an airplane before, would have to learn how to build warbirds faster than anyone thought humanly possible. Factories across America whispered, "Ford's gone mad. You can't mass-produce bombers." But Sorensen didn't listen. Every night, he walked the empty factory floor, tracing the path of the future with his flashlight. In his mind, he could already hear it, the steady heartbeat of the assembly line, the wings of war rising out of the Michigan soil. "If we can build one every hour," he murmured, "we'll build the sky itself." And as the camera pans upward, past the echoing rafters, through the rain that falls from the roof, we fade to the next scene. The war is raging overseas, and in the heartland of America, a factory begins to awaken. Across the Atlantic, the world was burning. London's skyline glowed red from nightly bombings. In Stalingrad, soldiers fought room to room, bayonet to bayonet. In the Pacific, black smoke trailed from ships sinking beneath the waves. Every continent seemed to tremble beneath the same sound. Engines, gunfire, and the low hum of factories straining against time itself. For the United States, the war was now total. Factories no longer made cars or refrigerators or radios. They made guns, tanks, and planes. Every screw, every gallon of oil, every heartbeat was measured against one question: how fast can we produce victory? The B-24 Liberator, the plane at the center of it all, was one of the most advanced bombers ever built. With a range of 2,000 miles and a bomb load of 8,000 pounds, it could strike deep into enemy territory. It was faster, tougher, and more efficient than the B-17, but it was also harder to build. Each aircraft demanded more man-hours than any other plane of its time. Even with multiple contractors, Douglas, Consolidated, North American, production lagged behind the desperate needs of war. To win the air, the Allies needed thousands. To win the war, they needed them now. And so, in the midst of this storm, Ford Motor Company, the symbol of American industry, was asked to do something no car manufacturer had ever done before: build bombers. Henry Ford was already in his late 70s, a man whose beliefs often clashed with Washington and modern times alike. He despised war, distrusted politicians, and refused to build engines for combat in the First World War. But this time, it was different. The threat was existential, and his factories had the capacity to change the outcome. At his side was Charles Sorensen, known inside the company as Cast Iron Charlie. He wasn't smooth or eloquent. He wasn't the kind of man who wrote memos or gave speeches. He spoke in blueprints and prototypes. To him, machines were alive, and like all living things, they could be taught to move faster. Sorensen knew what Ford's plants had done to the automobile industry. Before the assembly line, cars were luxury items, crafted by hand, slow to build, expensive to own. But when Ford introduced mass production, it changed everything. Cars went from symbols of wealth to symbols of freedom. The same idea, he believed, could change the war. Yet this was not Detroit. This was war. On a cold February morning in 1942, Willow Run was still a field, snow-covered, muddy, quiet except for the whine of bulldozers. It was located west of Detroit, near the small towns of Ypsilanti and Belleville. By summer, it would become a city of its own, complete with housing, schools, cafeterias, and roads built solely to serve one purpose: to feed the line. The plant grew like something alive. Steel arches rose like ribs. Windows stretched for miles. Reporters who visited said it felt less like a factory and more like a new civilization. It was the physical manifestation of a nation's determination to outbuild death itself. But Willow Run wasn't built in a vacuum. It rose in the context of chaos. Raw materials rationed, supply lines stretched thin, labor forces changing overnight. Millions of men were overseas. And so, for the first time in Ford's history, the company opened its gates to women. Secretaries became welders. Housewives became riveters. By the end of the year, 1/3 of Willow Run's workforce would be female, a quiet revolution beneath the thunder of warplanes. Still, the early months were hell. The plant wasn't just assembling bombers. It was inventing how to build them. Blueprints changed daily. Tools broke. Subcontractors failed to deliver. The Army's inspectors demanded perfection from a system that had never existed before. Planes rolled out incomplete, sometimes missing parts, sometimes unable to fly. Critics mocked the project as Willow wrong. Even Henry Ford began to doubt, but Sorensen didn't. He moved through the chaos with the calm of a man who'd seen worse. He knew the pain of creation. He believed that once the rhythm took hold, once every worker, machine, and part moved as one, the line would sing. Outside, The world measured victory by battles. At Willow Run, it was measured by hours. Every rivet, every wrench turn, every sleepless night was part of another front, a quieter one. The war of production. The war of patience and steel. For Sorensen, there was no glory in it, no parades, no headlines. But he understood something others did not. Without factories like this, without the endless roar of American industry, the soldiers at the front would have nothing to fly, nothing to fight, and nothing to come home in. And so, while the world watched Europe burn, a different kind of war raged in Michigan, fought not with rifles, but with rivet guns. Each spark that flew from a welding torch was a silent promise that someone, somewhere, would live another day. Wars are not won on the battlefield, Sorensen once said quietly. They're won in the places no one sees. The wind howled across the unfinished hangars of Willow Run. Inside, men in coveralls stood in silence, staring at a machine that refused to become an airplane. Bolts didn't fit. Wiring harnesses were missing. Aluminum sheets warped under pressure. The bomber's skeleton hung from the ceiling like a carcass, almost alive, but not yet breathing. Charles Sorensen stood beneath it, hands buried in his coat pockets, his eyes cold and distant. All around him, the sound of hammers echoed, desperate, uneven, and out of sync. He could smell the oil, the welding smoke, the sweat of men who had worked through the night. But beneath that was another smell: failure. By the end of that winter, Willow Run had produced only a handful of planes. Not one of them had rolled off the line on time. Critics called the project a disaster. The Army Air Forces threatened to cut the contract. Even Henry Ford, who had once boasted that his plant would build one bomber every hour, began to retreat into silence. For the workers, morale sank with every passing week. Men slept in their cars to make the night shift. Women lined up before dawn in sub-zero temperatures. Inside, the heat barely worked. The factory's roof leaked. Everywhere, confusion, exhaustion, disappointment, and in the middle of it all, Sorensen, not an engineer of words or dreams, but of function. He was known inside Ford as the man who could make steel move. But even he had never faced anything like this. Not a line that built cars, but a line that built war machines. Charles Sorensen was not born to comfort. He was the son of a Danish blacksmith, raised among sparks and steel. By 1920, he was already Henry Ford's right hand, the man who had helped design the first moving assembly line at Highland Park. He'd watched Model Ts roll out like clockwork, each car identical, each second accounted for. But the B-24 was not a Model T. It was a monster of engineering, 56 feet long, 4 engines, over 1 million parts. Every bomber demanded not just precision, but collaboration, something the Ford system had never done before. And that, more than anything, was the challenge. You couldn't treat aircraft like cars. Each plane was unique, temperamental, and unforgiving. Every mistake cost lives, not customers. The Army's inspectors didn't trust Ford's methods. The aircraft engineers didn't trust the automen, and the automen, in turn, resented being told how to work. The result was chaos, an orchestra with no conductor. Sorensen, who despised inefficiency, began walking the line every morning. He'd stop beside a worker, study his movements, and time them with a stopwatch. Not to punish, but to understand. He believed that rhythm was everything, that a machine shop, when properly tuned, could breathe like a living creature. He said little, but his presence was enough. To the workers, his footsteps became a warning and a comfort. They began to trust his silence. They began to follow his rhythm. It was sometime after midnight when Sorensen called his team together. The factory lights hummed above them, pale against the fog of welding smoke. Sheets of aluminum glowed faintly under the lamps. He walked to the center of the floor, his breath visible in the cold. "Stop building airplanes," he said quietly. The room froze. Someone laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, but Sorensen's face was stone. He continued, Stop building airplanes and start building sections, wings, fuselages, tail assemblies. Build them separately. Move them. Join them. Like cars. You can't build a bomber all at once. You have to flow it. It was a revelation. Simple, almost obvious. But no one had dared to say it aloud. Up to that point, each bomber had been built in place, like a house. Workers had to climb ladders, drag parts across the floor, and crawl through the airframes. Every step was a struggle. Every inch wasted time. Sorensen envisioned something different, a line where the bomber would move, not the worker. He wanted the B-24 to travel down the factory, piece by piece, until it reached the runway, ready to fly. It was an idea that would redefine wartime production. But at that moment, it was only a sketch in the smoke. He stayed that night, drawing plans on scrap paper, rearranging crews, moving jigs and cranes. By dawn, his coat was covered in aluminum dust. The first prototype section rolled forward, slowly, awkwardly, but it moved, and when it did, the workers began to cheer. It wasn't a bomber yet, but it was a start. In the chaos of war, genius doesn't always come from brilliance. Sometimes, it comes from exhaustion, from a man standing under the flicker of a failing light, refusing to give up. Sorensen's breakthrough wasn't just mechanical. It was human. It came from seeing the rhythm where others saw disorder, from understanding that people, like machines, needed movement to survive. That night marked the rebirth of Willow Run. The failures didn't vanish overnight, but something had changed. The plant had found its pulse, and soon that pulse would become a heartbeat, steady, relentless, unstoppable. The factory was alive 24 hours a day. Even at night, the light never dimmed. Snow fell outside in silence, but inside Willow Run, there was no such thing as silence. Only the constant hum, drills, cranes, footsteps, voices, the metallic heartbeat of a nation at war. For the workers, the hours bled together. Day became night. Weeks became months. The only rhythm they knew was the rhythm of production. They called themselves Rosies and Riveters. But they were more than that. They were farmers' daughters, waitresses, teachers and mothers, suddenly turned into machinists, welders, and rivet gun operators. Most had never even held a tool before the war. Now they stood on scaffolds 40 feet high, leaning into roaring fuselages, driving steel bolts through the ribs of a bomber that would soon cross an ocean. One woman, name lost to time, once told a reporter, "We didn't think of them as bombers. We thought of them as our boys' wings. Every plane she helped build," she said, was her way of keeping her brother alive, and she wasn't alone. For thousands of women, Willow Run wasn't just a job, it was a form of prayer. On the catwalks above the line, Sorensen watched them all. Thousands of moving figures, faces blurred by motion and fatigue. To him, they were parts of the machine, necessary cogs. To them, he was the architect, distant, cold, unapproachable. He didn't smile, didn't thank, didn't rest. But the workers knew he was always there. Sometimes they'd catch a glimpse of him, pacing with his notebook, stopping to adjust a measurement, never speaking more than a few words. He had built something unstoppable, but even unstoppable things leave scars. One night, a young welder collapsed at her station. She'd been working 16-hour shifts for 3 weeks straight. When they carried her to the infirmary, her hands were still locked around the welding gun, her fingers burned and blistered. Word spread through the factory like a whisper. She fell asleep standing up. No one protested. No one stopped. The line kept moving, because in war, there was no pause button. Later that night, Sorensen found the empty spot where she'd stood. He didn't say a word, but for a moment, he didn't move either. He just stared at the place, as though trying to remember what it meant to be tired. The newspapers called Willow Run a miracle. They printed photographs of smiling women beside gleaming planes, headlines that said, "Ford's flying factory defeats Hitler's timetable." But the pictures didn't show the blisters. They didn't show the frostbite that crept through the unheated hangars. They didn't show the exhaustion or the loneliness of mothers who kissed their children goodbye before the night shift. And they never showed Sorensen's eyes. Behind his precision there was something else, a weariness that no amount of success could hide, because every bomber that left the line was both a triumph and a tragedy. He knew where those planes were going. He'd seen the photographs of London, Dresden, Cologne. He understood what it meant to turn machines into fire, but he also knew what would happen if he failed, so he built faster. Sometimes the factory mailroom would post letters from soldiers, handwritten notes from the airmen who flew the bombers Willow Run had built. They'd arrive from bases in England or North Africa, sometimes folded in envelopes still smelling faintly of oil and smoke. Dear ladies of Willow Run, I don't know your names, but I flew a Liberator you built. She took flak through the wing, lost an engine, but she brought us home. Thank you. The letters would be read aloud on break time, and for a moment, the exhaustion would lift. The laughter would return. The sound of the machines would feel almost like music again. It wasn't victory. It was meaning. One morning, Sorensen stood before a group of reporters who had come to tour the line. They asked him how it felt to know he was helping win the war. He looked at them for a long time before answering. It feels like watching a clock tick toward something you can't stop. The reporters didn't print that. They printed something shorter, safer. Sorensen proud of Willow Run production. But the workers who saw him that day noticed the difference. His face had changed. He looked older, smaller somehow, because the factory that had once been his dream was now consuming him too. There's a photograph taken in 1944, one of the most famous of Willow Run. It shows rows of women standing on scaffolds, faces lit by sparks, the unfinished bomber stretching endlessly behind them. They look proud, determined, unbreakable. What the photo doesn't show are the empty beds back home, the missed birthdays, the broken marriages. It doesn't show the price of becoming part of something so vast that individuality dissolves. Willow Run wasn't just a machine for bombers, it was a machine for people, reshaping them, consuming them, and, in its own way, forging them into something harder than steel. By 1944, the plant had reached its peak, producing a bomber every 55 minutes. It was efficiency beyond imagination, but the faster the line moved, the more human time disappeared. Sorensen once remarked that the factory could almost run without people. He said it as an engineer's compliment, but later, in a rare quiet moment, he admitted to a colleague, "Maybe that's the problem. We made it too good. We forgot the people." The bombers continued to roll out, silver and flawless, each one carrying the labor of 10,000 hands. They were the embodiment of victory, of American might, and yet, beneath every wing, there was a shadow, the shadow of what it took to build them. The hours lost, the lives bent by fatigue, the silent sacrifices that would never be named. When the last bomber of the day lifted off the runway, the workers sometimes gathered outside to watch. They'd raise their hands, shielding their eyes from the sun, following the plane until it vanished into the clouds. They didn't cheer. They didn't cry. They just watched, knowing that somewhere far away, someone else would be counting on the wings they had. Built. Winter returned to Michigan. Snow piled against the factory walls, muffling the sound of engines. For the first time in years, Willow Run was quiet. The war in Europe was turning. Germany was retreating. The skies above Berlin now belonged to the Liberators, thousands of them, silver swarms blotting out the sun. The same bombers that had once rolled out of Willow Run by the hour were now rolling back from war, some battered, some missing entire crews. Inside the plant, the workers noticed something strange. Production orders began to slow. The constant urgency, the deafening rhythm that had ruled their lives, began to stutter. A message came down from Washington. Reduce output, scale back materials, prepare for post-war conversion. The war machine was easing to a stop, and no one knew how to live without its noise. By February, 1/3 of the factory floor was dark. Tools hung silent on their hooks. Crates of unused parts gathered dust. For the first time, workers could hear their own footsteps echo. To some, it was a relief. To others, it felt like losing purpose. One riveter said, "I used to wake up to the sound of engines. When it stopped, it felt like the world had stopped too." The men began leaving first, back to Detroit, or to new jobs in peacetime industry. Then the women followed, many returning to homes that now felt foreign. They had built bombers. They had built history. Now they were expected to go back to sewing machines and kitchens. Charles Sorensen sat alone in his glass-walled office. On the wall behind him hung the old production charts, graphs that once climbed like mountains, now leveling into flat lines. The war had given him purpose, precision, power. Now it was taking them all away. He stared at the map pinned to the wall, the world divided by red lines and black pins. Europe, the Pacific, the front lines he had fought for from behind his desk. Every red pin meant thousands of bombers that had flown. Every black one meant a loss. He knew, roughly, what that meant in human numbers. And as the silence grew heavier, he began to wonder if the sum of his triumph could ever outweigh the cost. The day the final B-24 rolled off the line, no one spoke much. There was no ceremony, no parade. The workers gathered quietly as the bomber, polished, perfect, almost luminous in the pale winter light, rolled toward the open doors. Its engines coughed to life, roaring against the still air. Someone began to clap. Slowly. Then the others joined in, filling the hangar with applause that echoed like thunder against the steel walls. Sorensen watched from above, unmoving. He had overseen the construction of over 8,000 bombers. Now, watching the last one taxi away, he felt the strangest thing of all, not pride, not sorrow, but absence, like a clock that had stopped ticking. In the years to come, people would call Willow Run the arsenal of democracy. They would say it proved what American industry could do when it believed in something greater than profit. They were right, but they also forgot what it cost. It had consumed people, time, and identity, turning human will into machinery. And now that the machine was shutting down, its creators were left asking, who were they, without the war? Sorensen himself had built an empire of movement, only to find himself standing still. After the war, Henry Ford returned to his office, older and slower, his empire still standing but scarred by age and ambition. Sorensen, who had been his right hand for 3 decades, expected gratitude, recognition, perhaps even friendship. Instead, he received dismissal. Ford had never been comfortable with anyone sharing the spotlight, not even the man who had made Willow Run possible. Tensions that had been buried during wartime surfaced like old wounds. Arguments erupted. Meetings turned cold. And one morning in 1944, before the last bombers were even complete, Sorensen was quietly forced out of the company he had built his life around. No farewell, no speech, just a signature on a piece of paper. He walked out of Ford Motor Company carrying only his briefcase, and a silence that would never quite leave him. In the years that followed, Sorensen rarely spoke about Willow Run. When journalists asked, he would give short, factual answers. Yes, the plant produced a bomber an hour. Yes, the system worked. Yes, it helped win the war. But if they pressed him about how it felt, about the people, the pace, the exhaustion, he would look away and say only, it was necessary. Necessary. That was his word for it. Not glorious, not triumphant, just necessary. The world had moved on, to cars, suburbs, television. The war became a chapter in a history book, its factories forgotten. But for those who had lived inside Willow Run, the sound of the assembly line stayed in their bones. Some swore they could still hear it in their sleep. The rhythmic thump of rivet guns, the hum of the line moving forward. It was the sound of purpose, and the silence that followed it was harder to bear than any noise. Years later, Sorensen returned to Willow Run. The hangars were empty now. Weeds pushed through the concrete. He walked the length of the old production line, the same mile of floor that had once echoed with life, until he reached the runway. The wind swept across the plain, carrying the faint smell of oil and dust. He stood there for a long time, watching the sky where the bombers had once lifted into war. Then quietly, almost to himself, he said, "We built wings for the world. I just wish we'd learned to use them better." August 15th, 1945. The war was over. Crowds flooded Times Square. Strangers kissed in the streets, and the radio voices that once counted the dead now spoke of peace. Factories that had never slept finally went dark. But in Michigan, at Willow Run, there was no celebration. Only the hollow echo of an empire of metal. Ending. For 4 years, this place had roared like a living beast, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, the silence was heavier than any victory. A single guard walked the length of the hangar, his footsteps bouncing off the empty rafters. On the concrete floor, he found a forgotten lunchbox. Inside it, a photograph of a young woman in overalls, smiling beside a bomber tail. Someone had gone home in a hurry and never came back to collect the past. The country was changing overnight. The soldiers came home, the women left the factories, and the war industries turned toward consumer goods, cars, fridges, radios. The same machines that once forged war were now asked to forge comfort. And yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted forever. The people who had lived inside Willow Run could no longer see machines as just machines. They had watched what they could do, the way 1,000 parts, assembled with precision and faith, could bring both victory and ruin. Many of them never worked in factories again. A few stayed on, helping convert Willow Run into a civilian production line. But the rhythm had changed. No more urgency, no more danger, no more purpose that felt like life or death. Just production, without cause. By 1947, parts of Willow Run were leased to other companies. A few hangars became storage. Others fell silent. Grass began to grow between the concrete slabs. At night, locals said they could still hear the echoes, the ghosts of the line, the faint hum of engines that weren't really there. Some called it superstition, others, memory. For those who had once stood here, covered in grease and sweat, that hum was more than a sound. It was identity. It was belonging. It was the song of a generation that had built wings for freedom, and then vanished into history's noise. Charles Sorensen retired quietly, away from Ford, away from the spotlight. He lived a modest life, wrote a few papers, gave a few interviews, but he never built anything like Willow Run again. Those who met him late in life said he still carried the war in his eyes. Behind the sharp engineer's logic was a quiet grief, the kind that comes not from defeat, but from understanding too much. He once told a journalist, "We proved what human hands can do when they work together, but we also proved how easily that power can be used for destruction." He never said more than that. Because for Sorensen, words were unnecessary. He had already said everything in steel and fire. In the decades that followed, Willow Run became legend. Historians called it the factory that beat Hitler. Documentaries hailed it as proof of American genius, of how democracy could outbuild tyranny. But few remembered the people, the women who bled their hands raw riveting metal, the mechanics who fell asleep at their stations after 16-hour shifts, the engineers who traded years of their lives for a single hour of production time. They were the quiet army, unseen, unarmed, and unforgettable. When the last bomber flew from the plant, they didn't cheer. They just watched it vanish into the sky and whispered, "Bring them home." Decades later, a museum was built on the site. Visitors came to see the gleaming silver fuselages, the assembly tools, the photographs of endless lines of workers. In a glass case, a single lunchbox was displayed, the one found on the hangar floor after the war. Beside it, a note, "To my boy in Italy. I'll keep building till you're back." The boy never came home, but his mother's bomber had flown, maybe even saved another's son. That was the cruel symmetry of war. Every victory had a shadow. Every machine had a heartbeat inside it. When people speak of World War II today, they remember the generals, the battles, the maps. Few remember the factories. Fewer still remember the men and women who made victory possible from behind the lines. But history is not just written in gunfire. It is built, rivet by rivet, bolt by bolt, by hands that no one ever photographs. At Willow Run, they built bombers faster than anyone believed possible. They built them with hope, exhaustion, and quiet pride. And when it was over, they went back to ordinary lives, leaving their miracle behind. The world moved on, but the echo of their work still hums beneath every flight that crosses the sky. One summer evening, long after the war, a single restored B-24 flew over Ypsilanti. The old bomber's engines rattled the windows as it passed above the empty fields where the factory once stood. People came out of their homes to look up. Some covered their ears, others simply listened. And for a moment, just a moment, it was 1943 again. The sky was alive. The war was still being fought. And somewhere below, in the vast belly of Willow Run, 1,000 hands were still working, still believing that what they built could change the world. The world that rose from the ashes of 1945 was brighter, faster, louder. Jets replaced propellers. Cities reached for the clouds. People spoke of a new age, of peace, of progress, of the future. But somewhere, in the heart of that future, still lay the echo of a factory that once beat like a living heart. Willow Run. Now just a name, a shadow of an age when steel, sweat, and faith turned a nation's fear into motion. The bombers were gone. But the sound remained. If you listen closely, you can still hear it. The deep, rhythmic hum of 1,000 engines rolling toward destiny. History rarely remembers the ones behind the curtain. The riveter whose hands shook from exhaustion. The draftsman who stayed late to correct a single blueprint line. The young woman who carved her name inside the bomber's tail so that some piece of her would fly into history. They had no medals, no parades, no graves marked by white stone. Their victories were made of noise and dust, erased as quickly as they appeared. But every plane that soared into the clouds carried them. Their work, their touch, their faith. It was their rhythm that filled the sky. Their patience that made flight possible. Their sacrifice that became invisible the moment the war ended. War has a way of hiding its truest heroes. They are not always the ones who pull the trigger, but the ones who hand over the tools. Not those who shout commands, but those who whisper, "It will hold." Sorensen once said, "Production is the art of making things work." But what he built went far beyond production. He gave shape to something larger. A belief that ordinary people, united by urgency, could move the world one bolt at a time. And yet, when the war was done, that unity scattered. The hands that built the sky went back to sweeping floors, raising children, fading into history's quiet corners. Today, in every assembly line across the world, in every factory that hums through the night, the spirit of Willow Run still lingers. The concept of mass production, the choreography of movement, the idea that complex machines could be born like living things, all of it began there. But its truest lesson was never about speed. It was about purpose. A purpose so vast it turned factory workers into soldiers of industry. A purpose so heavy it left them hollow when it was gone. Because when the line stopped, many realized something they had never dared to say aloud. They hadn't just built bombers. They had built a mirror, one that showed what humanity could achieve when united, and what it could destroy when divided. Each year, a single B-24 still flies, rebuilt, preserved, its engines trembling with age. It takes off from the same ground where Willow Run once stood. The fields are quiet now, but when that plane rises, the sound rolls across the earth like thunder remembering itself. People look up, shielding their eyes. They see the silver wings glinting in the sun, and for a heartbeat, Time folds. They are back in the 1940s. The line is moving. The rivets are firing. And somewhere in the distance, Charles Sorensen is still standing on the catwalk, watching his dream come alive. The bomber climbs higher, engines roaring, a hymn of iron, a requiem of motion. And as it fades into the clouds, the only thing left is silence. Not an empty silence, but the kind that follows after something immense, something human, something that changed the world. History will always remember the generals, but it is in the silence, in the spaces between their names, that we find the truth. It was not glory that built the B-24s. It was not conquest. It was the quiet courage of thousands who believed that what they built mattered. And in that belief, in the endless hum of the assembly line, in the weary faces under factory light, in the stillness after the last engine stopped, they gave the world wings. Wings made not only of aluminum and rivets, but of every heartbeat that refused to give up.